Rain hammered against the windows of Helsing Manor. Inside the war room, Integra Fairbrook Wingates. Helsing stood before a map spread across mahogany, her fingers tracing ley lines that ordinary strategists would have dismissed as superstition. The compass needle on the table shivered. Not magnetic interference. Something else. She had spent 3 hours cross-referencing anomalies. Biological disturbances that didn't match any known pathogen signature. Energy readings that made her technical advisors suggest equipment malfunction. But Integra knew better. 47 data points, all converging on a single geographic coordinate. Underground, industrial, hidden beneath layers of corporate deception and reinforced concrete. The location itself was mundane. An umbrella corporation chemical plant publicly listed as manufacturing pesticides and fertilizers. But the seismic readings told a different story. Massive subterranean construction, power consumption patterns, inconsistent with surface operations, and most damning, the biological signatures. Death concentrated and multiplied, emanating from below ground like heat from a furnace. She lifted the red glove from its case. The leather was old, reinforced with silver threading and inscribed with words that predated modern English. Helsing, Hell's Gate arrested, got miduns. And shine heaven now. Integra had inherited both the organization and its most dangerous asset. Some called it a curse. She called it a weapon. "You know what I'm considering," she said to the empty air. The shadows in the corner thickened, not gradually, but with the abruptness of a door opening. Alucard stepped forward, his red coat settling around him as if it had weight independent of fabric. The lamplight caught his glasses' twin circles of amber that obscured whatever expression his eyes might have held. A location with that much death usually is. His voice carried amusement, the kind that came from having witnessed centuries of human stupidity. Science playing with forces they've labeled and cataloged but never understood. Tell me it's not a rescue mission. It's not. Integra placed the glove on the table between them. I'm not sending you to save anyone. I'm authorizing you to investigate a biological anomaly that conventional forces can't handle. If there are survivors who prove capable, they'll survive. If not, they were never going to. Alucard's smile widened slightly. Not with joy, but recognition. This was why he served her. Not because of the seal, not because of ancient contracts, but because Integra Helsing understood what he was. A catastrophe that could be aimed. She lifted the glove and held it before him. The inscriptions began to glow faint at first, then bright enough to cast shadows. This wasn't theater. The control art restriction system responded to specific conditions, specific words, specific intent. Integra had memorized the protocols before she turned 12. Situation A, she said. The response came not from her, but from the glove itself. The words resonated through the room with a voice that belonged to no one living. Approval of Situation A acknowledged. Commencing the Cromwell invocation. Restriction, art release level minimal. Target coordinates confirmed. Alucard raised his left hand. The seal on his glove pulsed in answer, the inscriptions rearranging themselves. Not breaking, but inverting. Hell's Gate arrested became something else. A lock turned backwards. The air 3 feet to his left split open. No flash of light, no dramatic thunder. Just a vertical slash of absolute black, as if reality had been cut and the wound refused to close. The edges didn't shimmer or glow. They simply were, and looking at them too long made Integra's vision blur. A facility where science hides its failures. Alucard said, already moving toward the opening. They usually are entertaining. He stepped through. The tear in space collapsed behind him like a mouth closing. The compass needle stopped shaking. The biological readings on Integra's monitors spiked once violently, then returned to their previous disturbing baseline. She looked at the map again. Whatever was about to happen in that underground facility, it wouldn't be a rescue. It would be a test of wills of worthiness of who understood that survival was earned, not granted. Integra turned off the lights and left the war room. Behind her, rain continued to fall on London, indifferent to the fact that she had just opened a door between worlds. The gate opened in darkness. Alucard emerged into a corridor that smelled of recycled air and industrial antiseptic. Emergency lighting bathed everything in red, the kind of illumination designed for crisis management. Metal walkways, concrete reinforced with steel, pipes running along the ceiling labeled with codes that meant nothing to him and everything to whoever built this place. A security camera pivoted toward him. Its lens focused, refocused. Then the red recording light began to strobe. Malfunction. Not because the camera was broken, but because what it was seeing didn't fit its recognition parameters. Alucard glanced up at it. The camera lens cracked. He took 3 steps forward before the intercom activated. A synthesized voice, gender-neutral and professionally calm. Attention! Biohazard anomaly detected in Sector 7. Initiating containment protocol. Security teams respond code black. Interesting. They already knew something was wrong. Not because of him specifically, but because whatever they were growing down here had been misbehaving before his arrival. The first infected rounded the corner at a sprint. Once human, now something else. Skin gray and peeling eyes, filmed white mouth open in a permanent grimace that might have been rage or pain or the last expression its face made before biology gave up. It didn't slow when it saw him, didn't hesitate, just launched itself forward with the single-minded hunger that defined its existence. Alucard stood still. The infected hit him teeth, sinking into his shoulder hands, clawing at his coat. He let it bite down. Let it taste what it thought was flesh. The creature's jaw locked instinct, overriding whatever remained of its nervous system. Then Alucard's shoulder knitted back together around the teeth. The infected tried to pull back, confusion registering in whatever passed for its brain. Too late. The wound sealed completely, trapping its jaw. Alucard reached up almost gently and removed the creature's head with one hand. The body dropped. He released the head a moment later. It bounced twice on the metal grating. "You're not even the appetizer," he said to the corpse. "Just proof that someone here thought they could weaponize death without understanding what death actually is." More footsteps. Multiple sets coordinated. Not shambling infected, but trained personnel moving in formation. Through the corridor's intersection, Alucard saw them. 6 figures in tactical gear, weapons raised, advancing with the discipline of professional soldiers. He smiled. Now, this might be interesting. The intercom crackled again. Different voice, this time human male, stress barely contained. "Security to Sector 7. We have an unidentified hostile. Specimen shows extreme threat markers. Authorization granted for lethal response." Specimen. They were already cataloging him, already trying to fit him into their framework of biological weapons and controlled mutations. Alucard appreciated the efficiency, even as he knew it would be utterly useless. The emergency lights continued their slow pulse. Red dark, red dark. In the distance, something howled. Not human, not quite animal. One of their other experiments, perhaps. wondering if the new arrival was predator or prey. Alucard's coat settled around him as he began walking toward the approaching security team. His footsteps echoed in the corridor, steady and unhurried. Behind him, the gate's entry point had already sealed, leaving no trace. Forward deeper into this underground complex where science had tried to play with the concept of death. They had no idea what they'd invited in. But they were about to learn. And if any of them proved worthy, if any of them showed the will to survive what was coming, then perhaps this would be more than just another massacre. Perhaps it would be entertaining. The camera above him sparked once, then went completely dark. 3 levels above Alucard, in a control room, insulated by steel and corporate protocol screens flickered with deteriorating feeds. The operator's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, logging each camera failure, each biometric anomaly, each data point that suggested the situation in Sector 7 had escalated beyond standard containment parameters. "Pull the backup feeds," the shift supervisor said. Her voice carried the flat professionalism of someone trained to treat catastrophe as routine. "I want thermal imaging on that corridor. Whatever took out those cameras, I want it tagged and tracked." The thermal overlay loaded. For 3 seconds, the screen showed exactly what it should: ambient temperature gradients, the cooling corpse of the infected heat signatures from active electronics. Then in the center of the frame, a shape that registered as room temperature. Not cold like a corpse, not hot like a living human, just there, perfectly calibrated to the surrounding air. "That's not possible," the operator said. "Log it anyway." The supervisor reached for the red phone. Direct line, no switchboard, no recording. When someone answered, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We have a critical biological anomaly in Nest. Specimen is mobile, hostile, and outside all known classification parameters. Recommend immediate deployment of USS retrieval team." The voice on the other end asked one question. "No," the supervisor said. "Don't sterilize yet. We need samples, and we need the hard drives from Sector 7 before we lose everything." She hung up. The thermal image on screen flickered once. Then the camera died. The shape that shouldn't exist had moved, not toward the surface, but deeper, into the parts of Nest where the real research happened. 20 minutes later, 6 men assembled in the staging area 2 levels above the contamination zone. Umbrella's security service designated Team Nest Wrecker for this specific operation. They didn't use names on missions, just call signs and functions. The team leader checked his HK MP5, then keyed his radio. "Nest Wrecker Alpha, equipment check. Bravo, SMG loaded breaching charges primed. Charlie, LE5 ready optics online. Delta, TMP loaded flashbang secured. Echo, medical kit stocked, backup weapon hot. Foxtrot, C4 prepped, detonators armed." Professional, efficient. They'd done this before. Bioweapon retrieval, sample acquisition, witness elimination, standard Umbrella cleanup protocol. The brief had been simple. Sector 7 contained an unidentified biological threat. Retrieve research data, acquire samples if possible, neutralize the specimen if necessary. No survivors among contaminated personnel. Alpha studied the tablet showing the facility layout. Red zones marked areas of confirmed infection. Yellow zones indicated structural damage. The route to Sector 7's research server room cut through both. Standard approach, advance information use, overwhelming firepower. Extract under time pressure, leave nothing usable behind. Rules of engagement, Alpha said. Anything that moves gets tagged and assessed. Unknown specimens get full suppression fire. We're not here to study it, we're here to bag it. Questions? No one spoke. Move out. They entered through a reinforced airlock, the kind designed to contain chemical spills and prevent atmospheric contamination. The door sealed behind them with a hydraulic hiss that echoed in their helmet comms. Emergency lighting guided them forward. Red bulbs spaced every 10 meters designed to preserve night vision while providing minimal illumination. The corridor smelled wrong. Not the expected scent of decay or chemical antiseptic, but something else. Copper and cold concrete, and underneath it all, something that reminded Charlie of old churches, incense and funeral flowers. Thermals picking up ambient irregularities, Delta said, studying his scope. No clear heat signatures, but the air temperature is fluctuating. Might be ventilation damage. They advanced in textbook formation. Alpha and Bravo on point, Charlie and Delta covering angles. Echo in the middle with medical support, Foxtrot watching their 6 with the heavy explosives. Every corner checked every doorway, cleared every shadow treated as hostile until proven otherwise. The first body appeared 30 meters in. One of the facility's security guards slumped against a wall. The neck bent at an angle that suggested the spine had been removed with surgical precision. No blood spray, no defensive wounds, just a corpse positioned almost carefully as if someone had wanted it found. "Document and move," Alpha ordered. "We're not forensics." They photographed the body and continued. 3 more corpses in the next corridor, all displaying similar precision damage. Not mauled like infected kills, not burned like flamethrower work. Just methodically destroyed, each one killed with what appeared to be intimate knowledge of human anatomy. "Whatever did this knows exactly how people come apart," Echo said quietly. Foxtrot checked the blast door ahead. "Sealed from our side. Need 30 seconds to breach." "Do it." Delta Echo watched the rear corridor, Charlie optics forward. The C4 charge was small-shaped to blow the lock mechanism without collapsing the entire frame. Foxtrot, armed it, signaled the countdown with hand gestures, and everyone turned away. The explosion was sharp and professional. The doors sagged open, smoke curling from the destroyed lock. Alpha moved through first MP5 up, laser sight cutting through the haze. The room beyond was a laboratory. Workstations, microscopes, refrigeration units. And in the center, surrounded by broken glass and scattered papers, stood a man in a red coat. He wasn't hiding, wasn't preparing an attack. Just standing there, examining a vial of something that glowed faintly under the emergency lighting. His coat looked like it belonged in a different century. His posture suggested complete unconcern about the 6 assault rifles now aimed at his center mass. "Down on the ground." Alpha's voice carried the authority of a man used to immediate compliance. "Hands where we can see them now." The man in red looked up. His glasses caught the light, turning his eyes into twin amber circles. When he smiled, it was the expression of someone who'd just been told an excellent joke. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," he said, setting down the vial with exaggerated care. "But I'm afraid I can't comply. You see, getting down would ruin my coat, and I'm rather fond of it. Last warning. Ground. Now." Alucard raised both hands, palms forward, the universal gesture of surrender. "Very well. I suppose we should do this properly." Alpha fired. 3-round burst, center mass professional grouping. The rounds hit exactly where they were aimed. The target staggered back, red blooming on his shirt beneath the coat. "Hostile down," Alpha reported. "Approaching to confirm." They advanced in pairs, weapons still trained on the body. Standard protocol, 2 shots to the head to confirm termination of any biological threat. Alpha raised his weapon for the follow-up. The corpse sat up, not slowly, not with the awkward jerking of reanimated infected, just smoothly, casually, as if lying on the floor, had been a brief inconvenience. The bullet wounds were already closing, flesh knitting together, with the sound of wet fabric being pulled tight. "Thank you," Alucard said, standing. He brushed at his coat where the bullets had penetrated. "I needed to calibrate, get a sense of what you're working with. Modern ammunition, good accuracy, professional training." He looked directly at Alpha, but no understanding whatsoever of what you're actually fighting. "Suppressive fire?" Alpha's voice had lost its professional calm. "Light it up." All 6 weapons opened fire. The confined space turned into a storm of muzzle flashes and ricocheting brass. Bullets tore through the target, through the equipment behind him, through the concrete walls. The man in red jerked with each impact, coat flaring out like wings. 30 seconds. 200 rounds, give or take. The team's magazines emptied nearly simultaneously. In the sudden silence, their ears rang. Smoke drifted through the laboratory, illuminated by the emergency lights. The target lay on the ground, coat spread around him, body riddled with more holes than seemed physically possible. No movement, no breathing. No heat signature when Delta checked thermal. "Confirmed termination," Alpha said, but his voice suggested he didn't believe it. Bravo approached, sidearm drawn for the headshot. 3 feet away, 2 feet, close enough to see the damage, the shredded flesh, the exposed bone. Alucard opened his eyes. Bravo fired point blank into the face. The bullet went through, exited the back of the skull, embedded in the floor. Brain matter sprayed across the concrete. The corpse grabbed Bravo's ankle. "Your guns," Alucard said, his voice unchanged despite the destroyed jaw, "are wonderfully loud. But I'm afraid they're addressing the wrong kind of problem." The hand tightened. Bravo's ankle shattered with a sound like green wood breaking. He screamed, tried to pull away, fired 3 more rounds into the thing holding him. Might as well have been shooting water. The rest of the team opened fire again, but Alucard was already moving. Not the shambling of infected, not the enhanced speed of a BOW, but something else. He flowed between bullets, his body seeming to bend physics. The shadows in the room thickened around him, becoming almost solid. Charlie got off a burst that should have cut him in half. The rounds passed through what looked like smoke. A hand emerged from the darkness, gripped Charlie's weapon, and crushed the barrel like aluminum foil. Flashbang. Echo pulled the grenade, thrown blind. The explosion of light and sound filled the corridor. Standard anti-personnel device designed to incapacitate through sensory overload. When the echo faded, Alucard stood exactly where he'd been, head tilted slightly. That was new. Unpleasant, but new. "Thank you for trying." Foxtrot didn't hesitate. He armed the C4 on his vest, the dead man switch in his hand. If he was dying, he'd take the whole corridor with him. "Brave," Alucard acknowledged. "Stupid, but brave." The shadows moved faster than Foxtrot could process. The C4 was plucked from his vest, with surgical precision tossed casually through the laboratory door. The explosion came 3 seconds later, muffled by distance, collapsing part of the ceiling in the next room. Delta was running before the blast finished. Training had failed. Protocol had failed. The only thing left was the most basic human instinct: flee. He made it 10 meters before something caught his leg. Not a hand. A shadow solid as steel cable wrapped around his calf and dragged him backwards. "Where are you going?" Alucard's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "We're not finished cataloging each other." Delta's radio was still active. His screaming broadcast up to the control room, clear and high, and cut off abruptly. Alpha and Echo backed toward the blast door, weapons, empty hands, shaking. The professional soldiers who'd walked in with absolute confidence now reduced to the same panic as any civilian facing the incomprehensible. "What are you?" Alpha managed. Alucard stepped fully into the light, his coat settling around him. The bullet wounds were gone, the shattered jaw reconstructed. He looked exactly as he had before 200 rounds had torn him apart. "Your classification system calls things like me specimen ALC, I believe. But that's inadequate. I'm what happens when death decides to take a walk, when the grave gets bored and wants entertainment." He studied them with something that might have been pity. "Your virus, your biological weapons, your careful research into reanimation and enhancement. It's all just a pale shadow of something much older. Something you've been trying to recreate without understanding what you're actually reaching for. Umbrella will try to contain this, document it, weaponize it. I know, they always do. And it never works." Alucard glanced at the cameras in the corner. Several were still active, recording everything. "But please do try. I'd hate for this to be boring." Alpha reached for his sidearm. The motion was pure reflex muscle memory overriding reason. He knew it was useless, knew it before his hand reached the holster. Alucard waited. Let him draw. Let him aim. Let him fire the entire magazine into center mass, watching each bullet punch through and exit, knowing it meant nothing. When the slide locked back on an empty chamber, Alucard nodded. "You died well. That's worth something." The shadows consumed them. The cameras caught movement darkness, then static. When the feeds finally cleared, the laboratory was empty, except for equipment and brass casings scattered across the floor like confetti. In the control room, the supervisor stared at the dead screens. Her hand trembled as she reached for the red phone again. "Sterilization protocol," she said. "Release all containment units to Sector 7. I don't care what it takes. Keep that thing down there." She didn't wait for confirmation before hanging up. On the remaining monitors, warning lights began to flash. Throughout, nest locks disengaged. Doors opened. Things that had been caged for study and testing were suddenly catastrophically free. And somewhere in the darkness of Sector 7, something laughed. The streets of Raccoon City burned. Jill Valentine pressed herself against the brick wall of what used to be a pharmacy, breathing hard, trying to ignore the pain radiating from her left side, where something had clawed through her tactical vest 3 blocks back. The wound wasn't deep, but it was still bleeding. She'd used the last of her bandages an hour ago. Now she just had pressure and willpower. Carlos Oliveira crouched beside her, his UBCS uniform torn and stunned with substances Jill didn't want to identify. His assault rifle hung from its sling magazine nearly empty. They'd learned the hard way that noise attracted more problems than it solved. "Subway station is 2 blocks north," Carlos said, keeping his voice low. "If the tunnel isn't collapsed, we can use the maintenance access to get around the main infestation." Jill checked her Beretta. 6 rounds left. She'd been counting since the ammunition shortage became critical. 6 rounds meant 6 decisions about what was worth shooting and what was worth running from. Everything else was evasion and creative problem solving. "The main tunnel will be packed," she said. "Infected tend to follow established pathways. We need the service corridors." Carlos nodded. He'd stopped arguing with her tactical assessments somewhere around the 3rd near-death experience. Jill had been STRs trained for worst-case scenarios that most people couldn't imagine. Unfortunately, Raccoon City had exceeded even those parameters. They moved in near silence, using hand signals more than words. The city groaned around them, settling into its new role as a mass grave. Fires provided irregular illumination. Smoke made everything haze and shimmer. In the distance, something roared. Not human, not quite animal. One of Umbrella's experiments, loose and hungry. The subway entrance was partially collapsed, but the service door remained intact. Jill picked the lock with tools she'd scavenged from a maintenance closet, her hands steady despite the exhaustion. The door swung open on rusted hinges. Darkness beyond, but darkness meant no immediate threats. Probably. They descended into the tunnels, using a single flashlight between them to conserve batteries. The beam cut through dust and shadow, revealing concrete walls covered in safety warnings and infrastructure diagrams. This deep, the sounds from the surface became muffled distant. Almost peaceful if you could ignore what was happening above. There, Carlos pointed to a junction ahead. Maintenance Corridor B should connect to the industrial sector. Might give us a route around the plaza. Jill was about to agree when she noticed the diagram on the wall. A schematic of the underground infrastructure showing not just the subway tunnels, but the deeper layers beneath. Service corridors, utility access, and something else. A notation in small print. Umbrella chemical plant. Sub-level access. Her blood went cold. She'd read the reports, the classified files that STRs had accumulated before the organization was quietly dismantled. Umbrella didn't just operate on the surface. They'd built extensively underground hidden laboratories where oversight was minimal and ethical constraints were non-existent. "We need to go around," she said. Carlos studied the map. Around adds 30 minutes, and we don't know if that route is even clear. I know. But this corridor connects to Umbrella's underground facility. If there's contamination down there, we don't want any part of it. Jill, the entire city is contaminated. How much worse could it be? She didn't have a good answer for that. Just instinct, the kind that had kept her alive when braver people had died. The feeling that some doors were better left closed, some paths better left unexplored. They compromised. Follow the maintenance corridor, but stay alert for any signs of Umbrella activity. If they saw anything unusual, they'd backtrack immediately. No heroics, no investigation, just survival. The corridor sloped downward deeper than the subway tunnels into spaces designed for engineers and maintenance crews who needed to service the infrastructure without disrupting surface operations. The walls here were cleaner, more industrial. Steel reinforcement, heavy-duty pipes, climate control systems that were still running despite the chaos above. Jill noticed the observation window first. A thick pane of reinforced glass set into the wall at shoulder height, designed to let service personnel check the chamber below without entering it. The glass was scratched and smudged, but still transparent. She stopped, raised her hand in a fist, the signal for immediate halt. Carlos froze, weapon coming up automatically. "What is it?" Jill moved to the window, slowly keeping her profile low. Looked through the glass into the chamber below. The corridor on the other side was identical to dozens they'd passed through. Emergency lighting, metal grating, industrial fixtures. Except this one had bodies. Not infected, stumbling and mindless, but corpses. Men in tactical gear lying in positions that suggested sudden, violent death. Professional soldiers by the look of their equipment. The kind Umbrella deployed when they needed something handled quietly and permanently. And standing among them was someone who didn't belong in any world Jill understood. He wore a coat the color of dried blood, long, anachronistic, completely impractical for any tactical situation. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if standing in a room full of corpses was the most natural thing imaginable. As Jill watched, something moved in the shadows at the corridor's far end. A hunter, one of Umbrella's BOW units, all claws and genetically engineered aggression. It charged the man in red with the speed that had made hunters so deadly. fast enough that most people couldn't react powerful enough to tear through body armor. The man didn't flinch, didn't raise a weapon. Just stood there as the creature covered the distance in seconds, claws extended for a killing strike. The hunter hit him dead center. Jill saw the impact, saw the claws penetrate, saw the man's body jerk with the force of it. Any normal person would have been disemboweled, dying before they hit the ground. The man in red looked down at the claws embedded in his chest. Then he looked at the hunter. Even through the dirty glass, even at this distance, Jill could see his expression. He smiled. His hand came up and gripped the hunter's skull. The creature tried to pull back, tried to use its superior strength to break free. Didn't matter. The man's fingers tightened, and the hunter's skull collapsed like an eggshell. The creature dropped twitching once before going still. The man pulled the claws out of his chest. The wounds closed as Jill watched flesh knitting together with a speed that violated every principle of biology she understood. He brushed at his coat where the blood had stained it, the gesture almost fastidious. Then he turned and looked directly at the observation window. Directly at Jill. She jerked back from the glass, heart hammering, grabbed Carlos's shoulder and pulled him away from the window, away from the corridor, back the way they'd come. "What did you see?" Carlos whispered, following her retreat without question. "Something that isn't part of any outbreak I've ever studied. Something that just killed a hunter with its bare hands and regenerated from lethal wounds like they were scratches." "That's impossible." "I know. That's why we're leaving. Now." They backtracked to the junction, taking the longer route, the one that added 30 minutes, and went through potentially more dangerous territory. Jill didn't care. She'd spent the last several hours learning to categorize threats, to assess what could be handled and what had to be avoided. The infected could be managed with careful planning and resource conservation. The hunters were dangerous, but predictable. Even the lickers, blind and vicious as they were, followed patterns that could be exploited. But what she'd seen through that window didn't fit any category she had. It wasn't a BOW created in a lab. It wasn't infected with the T-virus. It was something else entirely, and the fact that it was down there in Umbrella's facility during a city-wide outbreak that was rapidly spiraling toward total sterilization suggested a level of catastrophe that made their current situation look manageable by comparison. "That thing killed trained soldiers," Jill said as they navigated through a partially flooded tunnel. "Professional Umbrella operatives, the kind they send when they want something contained or eliminated. And it did it without breaking a sweat." Carlos processed that. "You think it's responsible for the outbreak?" "No. The timeline doesn't match. The T-virus contamination started before that thing could have arrived. But I think Umbrella encountered something they couldn't handle, tried to contain it, and failed catastrophically. Which means we don't go near it. We don't investigate. We don't try to fight it or study it or do anything except get as far away as possible. No argument here." Carlos checked his watch. "Evacuation window closes in 90 minutes. If we're not out of the city by then, we're not getting out." They pressed forward through the maintenance tunnels, using the service ladders to climb back toward the surface level. The route was longer, more circuitous, requiring them to navigate through spaces designed for infrastructure repair rather than human transit. But it kept them away from the underground facility, away from whatever was happening in those deep corridors. As they climbed, Jill heard sounds echoing from below. Not the moaning of infected or the screeching of BOW units. Something else. Screaming, maybe. Mechanical groaning as metal was stressed beyond its design parameters. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been laughter. She climbed faster. The surface access brought them out near the industrial sector 3 blocks from their previous position, but critically away from the underground facility. The streets here were just as devastated, just as full of shambling infected and abandoned vehicles. But Jill felt marginally safer. Better the devil you knew than whatever was happening beneath their feet. "Where now?" Carlos asked. Jill oriented herself using the burning buildings as landmarks. The evacuation point was northeast past the police station through territory they'd have to fight or sneak through. Normally, she'd planned the most efficient route balancing speed against safety. But efficient would have taken them near the maintenance tunnels that connected to Umbrella's facility. Efficient would have risked another encounter with whatever was down there. "We go around," she said. "The long way. Through the residential sector. That's going to be crawling with infected." "I know. But infected I can handle. Infected follow rules. They're predictable." She looked back at the access tunnel they'd emerged from. "What we saw down there doesn't follow any rules I understand. And I'm not betting our lives that we can handle it." Carlos followed her gaze, then nodded. "Fair enough. You kept us alive this long. I'm not going to start questioning your judgment now." They moved out, leaving the industrial sector behind. The maintenance tunnel access sealed behind them a heavy door designed to prevent unauthorized entry. Through its small window, emergency lights continued to pulse in the depths below. Jill didn't look back. Whatever was happening in Umbrella's underground facility, whatever that thing in the red coat was, it wasn't her problem. Her problem was getting herself and Carlos out of the city before Umbrella decided that sterilization was the only option left. She had 6 bullets and 1 badly injured teammate. The city was dying around them, and somewhere beneath their feet, something laughed in the darkness. But none of that mattered as long as they kept moving. As long as they didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't make the mistake of thinking they could handle one more threat. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or the most heavily armed. It was about knowing when to fight and when to run. And everything Jill had learned, everything that had kept her alive through this nightmare, was screaming the same message. Run. Don't look back. And pray that whatever was down there stayed down there. The thing that hunted Jill Valentine had a designation Nemesis T-type. Umbrella's pinnacle of BOW engineering, designed for a single-purpose pursue and terminate at Desoas. TARS members with absolute prejudice. Its intelligence was limited but focused. Its strength was considerable. Its programming was absolute. It stood at the junction where 3 corridors met, massive frame blocking most of the passageway. The emergency lighting made its pale skin look even more corpse-like, highlighting the surgical scars and integration points where biological tissue met technological enhancement. The coat it wore was in tatters, shredded by combat and movement through spaces not designed for something its size. Nemesis had been tracking Jill for hours, following her scent through the chaos of Raccoon City. The trail had led here to these underground passages and then diverged. Multiple paths, multiple possibilities. The creature's limited cognitive function struggled with the decision tree. Then it heard something else, not the familiar scent marker of its primary target, but noise from deeper in the facility. Gunfire, lots of it sustained and professional. Then screaming. Then silence. The pattern repeated. Combat termination, silence. Over and over, moving through the underground complex with mechanical efficiency. Nemesis turned its head toward the sound. The biomechanical augments in its skull processed the information, trying to categorize what it was hearing. Not infected, not human civilians, not STARS members. Something else. Its programming had priority targets, but it also had threat assessment protocols. Umbrella had learned from earlier BOW failures. A weapon needed to recognize dangers, needed to avoid situations where it might be damaged or destroyed before completing its mission. Self-preservation ranked below mission completion, but it still registered. The creature took 3 steps toward the source of the disturbance. Its massive boots left dents in the metal grating. Whatever was down there had killed multiple combat teams. The thermal signatures from that direction showed temperature anomalies, biological inconsistencies. Something that didn't match Nemesis's recognition database. It stopped at the corridor entrance that led deeper into the facility. Stood there processing. Its programming insisted eliminate Steyar's targets, but its threat assessment was flagging warnings. Unknown hostile, combat capability extreme, biological classification error. Nemesis didn't understand fear the way humans did. It understood risk analysis. It understood probability of mission success versus probability of operational termination. And what it was calculating from the sounds and thermal readings ahead didn't favor engagement. A new sound echoed up from the depths. Not screaming this time, but laughter. Low and genuinely amused, the kind of sound that suggested whatever was making it had just witnessed something entertaining. The laugh echoed through the metal corridors, distorted by acoustics, but unmistakably human in origin. Except humans didn't laugh like that after killing multiple combat teams. Humans didn't regenerate from lethal damage. Humans didn't register as thermal anomalies that confused even Umbrella's sophisticated monitoring equipment. Nemesis's augmented brain made its decision. The target ahead represented an unacceptable risk to mission completion. Engaging it might result in operational termination, which would prevent the elimination of STRS targets. The logical choice was clear. It turned away from the corridor, refocused its sensors on the original scent trail. Jill Valentine was still in the city, still mobile, still a valid target. The mission remained unchanged: pursue corner, terminate. Whatever was happening in Umbrella's deep facility was outside its operational parameters. Let other assets handle it. Let Umbrella's containment teams deal with the anomaly. Nemesis had a singular purpose, and it would not be distracted. The creature began walking, following the scent trail that led away from the underground complex, back toward the surface, toward the residential sector where its target had fled. Its steps were measured relentless. It had all the time in the world. Jill Valentine was human, subject to exhaustion and injury and the need for resources. Nemesis was purpose-given form, and it would not stop until that purpose was fulfilled. Behind it, deeper in the facility, something else moved through the corridors. Something that had noticed the massive creature, assessed it, and found it. Interesting, but not immediately relevant. 2 predators, acknowledging each other's presence, choosing not to engage because neither was the other's preferred prey. Nemesis emerged from the underground access near the industrial sector. Rain had started falling, mixing with the smoke from burning buildings. The creature tilted its head back, water running off its scarred features, and processed the scent markers in the air. There. Northeast, past the commercial district, moving toward the evacuation zones. Jill Valentine, exhausted and wounded, trying to escape. Still trying to survive. Nemesis began to run. Its footsteps shook the ground, a rhythm that broadcast its approach to anyone listening. It didn't need stealth. It didn't need tactics. It just needed to close the distance and complete its programming. Far below in the depths of Nest, Alucard heard the heavy footfalls receding, heard the creature make its choice and leave. He smiled to himself, appreciating the decision. The thing had priorities, same as anyone, and it had been smart enough to recognize when a fight wasn't worth the cost. Respect, not much but some. At least it understood its limitations. He returned his attention to the containment units that Umbrella had just released. Hunter's Liquors failed prototypes that shambled and screeched. They came at him in waves, following the only programming they had: destroy the intruder. Alucard let them come. After all, he had his own priorities. And exterminating Umbrella's collection of failed experiments was proving to be an adequate way to pass the time, while the real interesting specimens made their decisions about survival. In the control room, the supervisor stared at screens that no longer made sense. Thermal imaging showed impossible readings. Motion sensors triggered and failed in patterns that suggested equipment malfunction, except the equipment had been triple-checked and recalibrated twice. The biological monitoring systems kept throwing error messages trying to classify something that existed outside their parameters. She'd lost 2 retrieval teams. Not scattered, not delayed, not requesting backup. Just gone their last transmissions, suggesting something that made her years of corporate crisis management training completely inadequate. The remaining security feeds from Sector 7 showed corridors empty except for bodies and spent ammunition. And in the center of it all, moving with unhurried precision, a figure in red who treated Umbrella's most secure facility like a personal hunting ground. "Ma'am," the operator's voice cracked slightly. He was young, probably his first real crisis. "The specimen is approaching Containment Bay 4. That's where we keep the active BOW units for field deployment." The supervisor made her decision. Protocol said to assess report, wait for authorization from higher command. But higher command was probably already evacuating burning documents, preparing to deny any knowledge of Nest's existence. She was on her own, and the thing in Sector 7 was systematically working its way through their facility. "Initiate containment release protocol," she said. "All units, everything we have in storage." The operator turned pale. "Ma'am, that's 47 individual specimens. Hunter's Liquors, 3 Tyrant prototypes. If we release them all simultaneously, then maybe 47 BOWs will be enough to slow it down. Or destroy it. Or at least give us enough time to purge the servers and seal the facility." She picked up the red phone one more time. "And activate the self-destruct sequence. 30-minute countdown. That's not enough time to evacuate. There's no one left to evacuate. Everyone in Sector 7 is already dead. We're just making it official." The operator's hands shook as he entered the override codes. On the main screen, warning lights began flashing throughout the facility. Hydraulic locks disengaged with sounds like gunshots. Reinforced doors designed to contain the most dangerous biological weapons Umbrella had ever created began to open. In Containment Bay 4, the first hunter emerged from its cell. 8 feet of genetically engineered killing machine, all muscle and claws and predatory intelligence. It had been starved, deliberately kept aggressive, and ready for field deployment. The moment the door opened, it launched itself into the corridor, seeking prey with single-minded hunger. 3 more hunters followed. Then, a pack of Liquors blind, but with hearing so acute they could track a heartbeat through concrete walls. Their tongues lashed the air, tasting for targets. Brains exposed through skull modifications that looked like someone had started an autopsy and never finished. Further down in the high-security wing, the Tyrant prototypes activated. Umbrella's attempt at creating the perfect soldier, 8 feet of bioengineered muscle wrapped around a nervous system that had been carefully stripped of anything resembling mercy or hesitation. They wore straight jackets, modified with reinforced restraints, not because they needed to be contained, but because Umbrella had learned that unrestrained tyrants tended to destroy everything in reach, including the facilities that housed them. The containment doors opened, and 47 separate nightmares, were suddenly free in a facility that had been designed to keep them separated, controlled, manageable. Alucard heard them coming before they arrived. The thunder of heavy footsteps, the skittering of claws on metal grating, the wet breathing of things that had been designed in laboratories and gestated in tanks. He stood in the center of a large chamber, what looked like it had once been a loading bay, and waited. The first hunter came around the corner at full sprint. It saw him, recognized him as prey, and committed to the attack with the absolute certainty of a creature that had been bred for one purpose. Its claws, extended muscles bunching for the killing strike. Alucard didn't move. Let it come. Let it commit. The hunter's claws tore through his chest, through his coat, through organs that should have been vital. The creature roared in triumph, already planning its next strike. Then Alucard's hand shot up and caught the hunter by its throat. The creature tried to pull back, confused by the lack of blood, confused by the fact that its target was still standing. Alucard squeezed. The hunter's neck collapsed like wet cardboard spine, severing with a crack that echoed through the loading bay. He dropped the corpse and looked at the others that had arrived. 2 more hunters circling. A pack of lickers clinging to the walls and sealing their exposed brains, pulsing with each heartbeat. And emerging from the far corridor, the first tyrant, its coat straining against muscles that looked capable of punching through tank armor. "Your masters really didn't learn," Alucard said conversationally. "Quantity doesn't solve a quality problem." The lickers attacked first, dropping from above in a coordinated strike. Their tongues shot out like spears, each one capable of impaling a human and dragging them back for consumption. Alucard let the first 3 hit him, puncturing through his torso, and then the shadows around him solidified. The darkness had weight. It had texture. It moved with purpose that had nothing to do with air currents or lighting changes. The lickers found themselves wrapped in something that felt like water and gripped like steel. They thrashed, trying to escape, tongues retracting in panic. Alucard crushed them. Not with his hands, but with the shadows themselves, compressing the creatures until their exposed brains burst and their genetically modified bodies went limp. He let the corpses drop, already turning his attention to the hunters that were trying to flank him. They were fast. Faster than human, faster than most BOWs. But speed meant nothing when your target could phase through solid matter. The first hunter's claws passed through Alucard like he was made of smoke. The second managed to draw blood, but the wound sealed before the claw finished its arc. Alucard grabbed both hunters simultaneously. His strength didn't look like strength, didn't involve bulging muscles or visible strain. He just held them, and they might as well have been pinned by industrial machinery. The creatures struggled, howled, tried every technique their limited intelligence could manage. He pulled. Slowly, deliberately, giving them time to understand what was happening. The hunters came apart like poorly assembled toys, limbs separating from torsos with wet, tearing sounds. Alucard let the pieces fall and wiped his hands on his coat. The tyrant had watched all of this. Its brain, such as it was, processed the information, calculated odds, assessed threat levels. Unlike the hunters and lickers, the tyrant prototypes had been given rudimentary tactical thinking, enough to make them dangerous against conventional forces. It saw Alucard standing among the corpses of creatures that had been designed to kill trained soldiers with ease. Saw him completely unmarked coat settling around him, as if the battle had been nothing more than an interruption. The tyrant made its decision. It charged. 8 feet of bioengineered muscle moving at speeds that violated common sense. Each footfall dented the metal floor. Its fist came around in a haymaker that could have demolished a reinforced door. Alucard caught the punch. His hand looked small against the tyrant's massive fist, but it stopped the blow completely. The tyrant's arm trembled with the force of arrested momentum muscles straining against resistance that shouldn't exist. "You're better than the others," Alucard observed. "You actually thought about it before attacking. That's worth something." He pulled. The tyrant, for all its strength, found itself dragged forward like a child. Alucard's other hand came up, fingers spread, and pressed against the creature's chest. Not punching, not striking, just touching. Then he pushed. The tyrant flew backwards, hitting the far wall with enough force to crack the concrete. It slid down dazed, trying to process what had just happened. Its enhanced healing factor kicked in immediately, repairing the damage, getting it back on its feet. Alucard was already there. Moving faster than the tyrant's enhanced perception, could track standing directly in front of it. The creature tried to strike again, tried to grab, tried to use any of the techniques Umbrella had programmed into its nervous system. Nothing worked. Every attack passed through empty air, or hit something that felt solid but yielded nothing. And all the while, Alucard watched with the expression of someone grading a particularly disappointing exam. "You're what they think evolution looks like," he said. "Bigger, stronger, faster. But evolution isn't about power. It's about adaptation. And you can't adapt to something you don't understand." His hand went through the tyrant's chest. Not cutting, not tearing, just phasing through flesh and bone like they were mist. When he pulled his hand back, it was wrapped around the creature's heart. Still beating, still pumping the specialized blood that kept the tyrant functional. Alucard crushed it. The tyrant dropped. Its healing factor tried to compensate, tried to rebuild the destroyed organ. But there was nothing to rebuild from. It convulsed once, then went still. More BOWs were arriving. The control room had released everything, and they came in waves. Hunters by the half-dozen lickers, crawling over every surface. More tyrants emerging from deep storage. The loading bay became a killing floor, creatures attacking with the mindless aggression of things that had been designed for one purpose. Alucard stood in the center of it all and began to work. He didn't fight like a soldier, didn't use tactics or strategy or careful conservation of resources. He simply existed in the space where the BOWs wanted to be, and they died for the presumption. Some he killed with his hands, others with shadows that moved like living things. A few he simply looked at, and they collapsed their nervous systems, unable to process what their senses were reporting. The control room watched it happen on the few cameras that were still functioning. Watched their entire BOW arsenal, creatures that had cost millions to develop and had never failed in field testing, get systematically dismantled by something that moved through them like a natural disaster. "Activate the lockdown," the supervisor said. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Seal Sector 7. Flood it with acid. I don't care. Just keep it down there." The operator entered the commands. Throughout the facility, blast doors began to close. Hydraulic systems that could withstand explosive breaching activated, creating barriers of reinforced steel between sections. The ventilation system reversed, pumping chemical suppressants into the sealed areas. In the loading bay, Alucard noticed the doors closing. Noticed the hiss of gas being pumped through the vents. Noticed Umbrella's last desperate attempt to contain what they'd failed to destroy. He smiled and kept working. The BOWs were thinning out now, the last of them making futile attempts to overwhelm him through numbers. A hunter got through his guard claws, raking across his face. His head jerked back, glasses knocked askew, and for a moment the cameras caught his eyes. Not human eyes. Not the eyes of anything that had ever been human. Ancient and hungry, and completely without mercy. The hunter died before it could register what it had seen. Alucard straightened his glasses and looked directly at the nearest camera. Looked through it at whoever was watching. The lens cracked under the weight of his attention. "You built toys," he said, his voice carrying through the facility's intercom system, hijacked by something that shouldn't have been able to interface with electronic equipment. "Dangerous toys, destructive toys, but still toys. You've been playing with death, trying to package it, control it, sell it. But you never understood what you were actually touching." The blast doors groaned. The reinforced steel designed to contain nuclear-level catastrophes began to warp. Not from physical force, but from something else. Pressure that came from nowhere and everywhere, reality itself objecting to the constraints being placed on it. "Death isn't a weapon," Alucard continued. "It's not a tool. It's not something you can manufacture in a laboratory and ship in a container. Death is what happens when everything else fails. When your science runs out. When your containment measures prove inadequate. When your contingency plans become obsolete." The main blast door buckled. The control room screens went dark one by one. Cameras failing not from damage, but from simple inability to process what they were recording. "And I am death taking a walk." The last screen went black. In the control room, alarms wailed. The self-destruct countdown continued its mechanical progression. 30 minutes had become 20. 20 would become 10. And Umbrella's most secure facility would become another crater. Another accident, another tragedy that would be blamed on terrorists or natural disasters or anything except the truth. The supervisor sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, listening to the facility tear itself apart. She'd worked for Umbrella for 12 years, had overseen experiments that would have horrified the public, had signed off on research that violated every ethical standard humanity had ever established. And none of it had prepared her for this. For the understanding that they'd been children playing with matches, never realizing they were standing in a warehouse full of explosives. The lights went out. The emergency backups failed. In the darkness, something laughed, and the supervisor understood with absolute clarity that she would not be evacuating from this facility. No one would. The city was dying in stages. Jill and Carlos made it 3 more blocks before they had to stop. Not because of infected, though there were plenty of those. Not because of BOWs, though they'd narrowly avoided a liquor pack near the shopping district. They stopped because Carlos was bleeding through the bandages Jill had applied 20 minutes ago, and continuing to push would mean losing him to blood loss before they reached the evacuation point. They took shelter in what used to be an apartment building. The first floor was clear, the residents having either fled or transformed into the shambling things that now wandered the streets. Jill helped Carlos into what looked like a kitchen, got him sitting with his back against the cabinets. "Let me see it," she said. Carlos pulled his hand away from his side. The wound was worse than he'd admitted. Deep laceration from when they'd squeezed through a gap in a chain-link fence, the infected pressing from behind. The edges were ragged, and it had been bleeding steadily despite pressure. Jill used the last of her first aid supplies. A spray that would disinfect and coagulate, bought from a shop that seemed like it existed in a different world. When you could walk into a store and buy things without worrying about whether the cashier would try to eat you. "How much time?" Carlos asked. Jill checked her watch. The evacuation window was precise. Umbrella had been nothing if not efficient in their crisis management protocols. 43 minutes. The chopper leaves whether we're on it or not. "Can we make it?" She looked at him honestly. At the blood, he'd lost the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he was favoring his left side. "If we don't run into anything else, if the route is clear, if you can keep moving." Too many ifs. But that had been the entire night. Every decision balanced on if might possibly. They'd survived this long on tactical thinking and desperate improvisation. No reason to stop now. Carlos managed a weak smile. Then we'd better not run into anything else. They rested for 5 minutes. Not because they wanted to, but because Carlos needed it, and Jill knew that pushing too hard now would mean he'd collapse completely later. She used the time to reload her handgun with the last magazine she'd scavenged from a dead police officer 3 hours ago. 9 rounds. Better than 6. Outside, something roared. Deep and resonant, the sound carrying across the dying city. Not close, but not far enough away either. Jill recognized it. The thing that had been hunting her, the massive BOW, that seemed to exist solely to end her life. She'd managed to avoid it so far through constant movement and tactical retreats, but it was still out there. Still tracking her. Still inevitable. "Time to move," she said. They exited through a back window, avoiding the front entrance where infected had started to gather, drawn by some instinct or residual memory of human habitation. The alley behind the building was clear except for abandoned cars and scattered debris. Jill led, weapon up, scanning corners. Carlos followed, moving slower than she liked, but steady enough. The evacuation point was northeast, at the edge of the city, where the quarantine hadn't fully locked down yet. A helicopter, 2 security personnel, and a window of opportunity that was shrinking with every passing second. Jill had the coordinates memorized, had planned 3 different routes, then abandoned all of them when the routes proved impassable. Now they were improvising, taking whatever path looked clear, adjusting every time they hit an obstacle. It was inefficient, dangerous, and the only option they had left. They made it 2 more blocks, passed through a section of the business district that had burned completely, buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks. The heat from the fires made the air shimmer, but it also meant the infected avoided the area. Too hot, too bright, too different from the cool darkness they seemed to prefer. Jill's radio crackled. She'd kept it on emergency frequency, hoping for any official communication. What she got was worse. "Attention all personnel. This is a final evacuation notice. Raccoon City sterilization protocol will commence in 30 minutes. All remaining survivors are advised to proceed to designated extraction points immediately. This is not a drill. Sterilization protocol will commence in 30 minutes. Carlos heard it too. Sterilization. They're going to destroy the city. Complete eradication. Every building, every street, every piece of evidence that Umbrella ever experimented here. Jill kept moving, kept scanning. We knew it was coming. The question was always when, not if. 30 minutes matched their evacuation window almost exactly. Umbrella's final solution, time to remove the crisis and any witnesses in one efficient operation. The people still trapped in the city. The infected, the failed experiments roaming the streets, all of it would be reduced to ash and rubble. Clean, complete, and deniable. They pushed harder. Carlos gritted his teeth against the pain, kept pace despite the blood loss. Jill counted rounds in her head, calculated distances, assessed every shadow for threats. The evacuation point was close now. 4 blocks, maybe 5. Achievable even at their current pace. That's when they heard the footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, shaking the ground with each impact. Jill knew what it was before she saw it. The thing that had been tracking her all night, the BOW, that Umbrella had designed specifically to kill STRS members. It came around the corner ahead of them, massive frame blocking most of the street. Nemesis. The word appeared on its equipment stenciled in white letters, like it was proud of what it had become. "Run," Jill said. Not a suggestion, not a debate, just the only tactical option that made sense. They ran. Carlos, despite his injury, Jill, despite her exhaustion, both of them moving with the desperate speed of people who understood exactly what was chasing them. Behind them, Nemesis followed. Not running, just walking with those enormous strides that covered ground faster than seemed possible. Jill pulled Carlos down a side street through an alley over a fence that left them both bleeding from new cuts. They could hear the creature behind them, could hear it simply smashing through obstacles that they had to climb. Relentless, inevitable. "Keep going," Jill gasped. "Don't stop. Don't look back." The evacuation point appeared ahead. A parking structure, its roof cleared for helicopter access. Jill could see the chopper rotors, already spinning, two men in tactical gear scanning the approaches. They saw Jill and Carlos' weapons coming up briefly before recognition kicked in. "Go!" one of them shouted. 30 seconds and we're airborne." Jill and Carlos sprinted the last 100 meters. Behind them, Nemesis rounded the corner, saw its target escaping, and finally began to run. The ground shook. Cars parked on the street rocked with the impacts. They reached the helicopter as it began to lift off. The security personnel grabbed them, hauled them aboard. Jill landed hard on the metal floor, Carlos beside her. The chopper rose, angling away from the parking structure. Through the open door, Jill saw Nemesis reach the roof, saw it stop at the edge, watching them escape. For a moment she thought it might try to jump, might attempt some impossible leap to drag them down. But it just stood there, watching, waiting, like it knew that even if they escaped tonight, the mission wasn't over. That there would be other cities, other outbreaks, other chances. The helicopter banked hard, putting distance between them and Raccoon City. Jill pulled herself to the door, looked back at the city that had been her home. Smoke rose from 1,000 fires. Buildings burned or collapsed. The streets teemed with infected, with failed experiments, with the evidence of Umbrella's hubris. "Sterilization commencing in 60 seconds, a voice said over the chopper's radio. Clinical professional, like they were discussing trash removal rather than the destruction of an entire city. Jill watched it happen. Saw the first missiles hit precise strikes on critical infrastructure. Saw the explosions blossom fire, spreading from impact point to impact point. The helicopter was far enough away now that the sound reached them seconds after the light. A series of rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Raccoon City burned. Not the slow decay of the outbreak, but the final absolute fire of sanitization. Every building, every street, every piece of evidence reduced to rubble and ash. Clean, efficient, and complete. Carlos sat up beside her, one hand pressed against his bandaged side. How many people were still down there? Jill didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The number was too high, too terrible, too completely meaningless in the face of what Umbrella had just done. The security officer pulled the door closed, cutting off their view. "You're lucky," he said. "Most people didn't make it out." Lucky. Jill looked at Carlos, at his blood-soaked uniform and exhausted eyes. Looked at her own hands, still shaking from adrenaline and fear. Looked back toward where the city used to be now, just a glow on the horizon. They'd survived. But survival wasn't the same as victory. They'd lost their home, their colleagues, their evidence. Umbrella would deny everything, spin it as a terrorist attack or industrial accident. The truth would be buried under paperwork and legal disclaimers and corporate restructuring. And somewhere in that burning city, somewhere in the depths of the facility, they'd fled from questions remained unanswered. What had been in those underground corridors? What had killed Umbrella's security teams with such precision? What had Jill seen through that observation window? The thing that had regenerated from lethal wounds and smiled while doing it. The questions would haunt her. But she was alive to be haunted. And that was something. The helicopter flew on through the night, carrying its survivors away from the sterilization zone. Behind them, Raccoon City continued to burn flames, reaching toward a sky that offered no answers and no mercy. In the ruins of Nest, deep below the surface, where even the sterilization fires couldn't immediately reach, something moved through corridors of twisted metal and collapsed concrete. The facility had been destroyed, the self-destruct protocol, completing what the surface bombardment had started. But destruction was relative when you'd been dealing in absolutes for centuries. Alucard walked through the wreckage, coat settling around him, despite the absence of wind. The gate had closed hours ago, the connection to Hellsing severed by distance and dimensional barriers. But gates weren't the only way to travel when you understood the spaces between spaces. He'd learned what he needed to learn. This world had no magic, no supernatural framework that would recognize him as anything other than an anomaly. But it had plenty of human arrogance, plenty of people playing with forces they labeled and categorized, but never truly understood. Not his concern, not his mission. Just an evening's entertainment in a facility that thought it could weaponize death. He stopped at what used to be the main entrance to Nest, now buried under tons of collapsed infrastructure. Above him, the city burned. Below him, the facility continued its slow collapse. Around him, the darkness that was both shadow and something more substantial waited patiently. Alucard smiled to himself. The world was full of umbrellas, full of people who thought they could control what they barely comprehended. And occasionally, when Integra needed to remind them of their limitations, he would take another walk. But for now, this particular lesson was complete. He stepped into the shadows and disappeared, leaving behind only rubble and unanswered questions. The kind that would show up in classified reports and sealed files marked with codes that meant someone somewhere knew that something had happened in Nest that didn't match any known biological weapon. Let them wonder. Let them theorize. Let them rebuild their facilities and restart their experiments and convince themselves that next time they'd be ready. They wouldn't be. They never were. Above ground, Raccoon City burned to ash. Below ground, Nest collapsed into its own foundations. And in London, in a manner that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, Integra Hellsing received a report that her asset had returned. Situation A concluded. Target investigated. Anomaly assessed. She filed the report and didn't ask for details. Some doors once opened were better closed quickly. Some questions were better left unanswered. The rain continued to fall on London, washing away, nothing changing. Nothing indifferent to the fact that somewhere across the Atlantic, a city had died and something older than cities had walked through its corpse.